Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about consumer choice theory. Before we get right into that, we should review a little bit about utility theory. Now, what is utility? Utility is the want-satisfying power of a good or service. So what that means is the ability of a good or service to provide you with satisfaction, right? And so utility analysis is the analysis of consumer decision making based on utility maximization. So what is utility, or a util? Well, Jeremy Bentham came up with sort of this idea of how we measure satisfaction, and the unit is a util, but it's pretty standard to just say, something gives me X amount of utility, right? So something that's sort of close to paramount importance in economics is this idea of marginal utility, right? And so here's sort of a way you can think about it. There's a nice little formula also. It's the change in total utility due to a 1 unit change in the quantity of a good or service consumed, right? When you see marginal, you should think of like an additional unit of a good or service. How much does utility change, right? And so here's a nice little table about, it seems to be digital apps downloaded and how marginal utility is derived from total utility of downloaded apps, right? So we have our total utilities going from 0 when we have no apps to 10 when we have 1 to 16 and so on and so forth. And you can see in column 3 marginal utility and how it's calculated there. And so here's kind of a graph that shows what we just saw in the previous slide. On panel B, we have a graph of total utility over downloaded apps. And in panel C, we have marginal utility over digital apps, right? And so something to kind of notice in that previous slide, if you want to go and look back at it, is marginal utility falls as more is consumed, right? Marginal utility equals 0 when total utility is at a maximum, right? And so this comes back to this extremely important principle of diminishing marginal utility. And all the principle of diminishing marginal utility says is that as more of any good or service is consumed, its extra benefit or its additional benefit declines, right? So increases in total utility from consumption of a good or service becomes smaller and smaller as more is consumed during any given period. And so here, this is the law of diminishing marginal utility sort of restated. As an individual consumes more of a particular commodity, the total level of utility derived from that consumption usually increases. Eventually, the rate at which it increases diminishes as more is consumed. So if increasing marginal utility existed, you would continuously just consume only one good or service because you consume one, right? Think about it again. Increasing marginal utility, this is sort of the opposite. I can have 1 unit of a good, but then the marginal utility in the next unit will go up, right? And then I'll have another unit. Okay, well then it's going to go up even more, so I'll just keep doing that. What's important is this idea that marginal utility diminishes for every new unit consumed. So we also want to think about a consumer optimum. So it's a choice of a set of goods and services that maximizes the level of satisfaction for each consumer, subject to the consumer's income, right? So when we say maximizes the level of satisfaction for each consumer, generally we're talking about maximizes each consumer's utility subject to their own budget or income, right? And so this is kind of a table here that will be used in a couple of examples. It may be good to sort of write this down or take a picture of this as you're, kind of following along, because I'll want to refer back to it. I have it on another computer open here so I can refer back to it while we go forward. So what we're going to do is kind of use that previous chart to kind of work through this a little bit. So what this is trying to tell you is how to find a consumer optimum. And essentially what you're doing is finding which buying choice or purchase choice, right, gives the consumer the most marginal utility per dollar, or the most bang for their buck, right? So the digital app, the first digital app gives 10, the second gives 9, the third gives 8, well, the first flash drive gives 8.3, and so on. So we had $26 of total income, is what we were told on the previous slide. So the first thing they're going to do is buy a digital app, right? And that costs $5, and you can see sort of on the right-hand side. And then the next marginal utility per dollar is 9 compared with 8.3. So they'll buy another digital app. And then it's 8 compared to 8.3. So they'll buy their first flash drive. So you kind of keep following that logic until you run out of money, you run out of income. A general rule of optimizing consumption is a consumer's money income should be allocated so that the last dollar spent on each good purchased yields the same amount of marginal utility when all income is spent, because this rule yields the largest possible total utility. Right? There's a little math kind of intuition behind this. The rule of equal marginal utility per dollar spent, right? A consumer maximizes personal utility or satisfaction when allocating money income in such a way that the last dollar spent on good A, good B, good C, good D, and so on and so forth yield equal amounts of marginal utility. So there's this kind of statement here that all the marginal utility per dollars are equal, right? So this kind of gets a little confusing, and this must be some sort of typo here. But what we have here is from the same table we were just looking at, but for some reason they've changed the notation from I believe it was C to S. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at these, right? And so what we're going to look at now is how a price change affects marginal utility per dollar and affects consumer choices, right? So this is what we had before, right? And so you had 4 amount of apps and 2 of flash drives, right? But now we're going to say that the price of digital apps falls to $4. So what happens? So at our previous allocation, we had 4 apps and 2 flash drives. The price fell, so we adjust that in our marginal utility per dollar equation and see what's happened. Our marginal utility per dollar has increased, right? Because price has fallen. So what does that mean? Well, now marginal utility per dollar for digital apps is now greater than marginal utility per dollar for flash drives. So what's the result? Well, we should buy more apps, and then marginal utility will fall again until it's at an optimum. All right? So consumption decisions are summarized basically in the law of demand. The amount purchased is inversely related to the price. A consumer's response to a price change, right? At a higher consumption rate, marginal utility will fall. We want to talk a little bit about what substitutions or substitution of goods, how that plays a role in consumer choice, right? So the substitution effect is the tendency of people to substitute cheaper commodities for more expensive commodities. And the principle of substitution is that the principle that consumers and producers shift away from goods and resources that become relatively higher priced in favor of goods and resources that are relatively lower priced. Now, it's also important to think about what purchasing power is, right? Well, purchasing power is the value of money for buying goods and services. If your money income stays the same, but the price of one good that you're buying goes up, your effective purchasing power falls, right? Your money doesn't go as far. You can think about it like that. And then there's also the real income effect. This change in people's purchasing power occurs when other things equal, right? The price of one good that they purchase changes. When that price goes up or down, real income or purchasing power falls or increases, right? And vice versa. So what do you think? Which do you think has a bigger impact on your own purchases? The substitution effect or the real income effect? And you can kind of think about that. So you may be thinking, well, that's all fine and well, but how do we come up with this stuff? How does a demand curve actually come about? Well, we think about a world or a story, and we assume income in this story, and we assume tastes, and expectations and the prices of related goods, and we assume that they're not changing as the price of the good changes, right? And we sort of make all these different guesses about how the world works, and from there we can get a demand curve and get sort of this theory. But so behavioral economics kind of comes in and thinks about things just a little bit differently. The behavioralists don't really think there's pure rationality, but that there's bounded rationality, that people are boundedly rational. However, people don't really behave as if they are completely rational, so that's where this comes in. And if the rationality assumption doesn't hold, then how can we say that utility-based assumptions hold? That's kind of a philosophical question. So despite the doubts expressed by many economists and behavioral economists at the forefront, most economists still continue to apply these assumptions as if people acted rationally and aimed to maximize utility. Basically, it boils down to this. It yields a clear-cut prediction, right? If we make these assumptions, it yields clear-cut predictions. And we can sort of make one clear-cut assumption and get this prediction, and then throw a little wrench into the model and throw a little difference. Maybe they aren't rational. We'll see what happens with the model. And that's sort of how the study evolves.